All right, folks, just wanted to take a moment or two to give you some general feedback about the practice quantitative analysis, FRQ. So in class, this was it. It was an information graphic concerning public education financing from 2002, and it showed the amount that individual states spent on education per pupil. Okay, that was one of the key features there, is that it's per pupil. So your first task, which a lot of people did very well on, was just to demonstrate that you can read the graph and the information in there. Identify the most common level of education spending by states in the Southeast. Okay, people did a nice job on that. Just like this practice response right here, according to the graph, the most common spending by states in the Southeast is $8,000 to $9,999. Now, the only errors we had, some errors were based on the fact that, unfortunately, the color scheme they chose to use in the graphic was all shades of pink and red. So it was sometimes hard to determine what level of spending was being used. Not your fault. Hopefully, they would not use that same kind of color scheme. Also, there was some misinterpreting the actual dollar amounts because that little part of the graph was a little fuzzy. Again, not your fault. The only time it was your fault is when you misread the question, and some people responded with the most common spending in the United States, and that's not what the question asked. They wanted to know what the most common level of spending was in the Southeast. So make sure you read the question carefully. Now for B, you were asked to describe, the first thing, you're asked to do two things in B. The first thing was to describe a similarity or difference in public education spending by state or region. So the first thing you want to do, again, is just to repeat the language of the prompt and start with like a difference in education spending is, or a similarity in education spending is. Now this response right here, they did both. They did it by region first and then specifically by state. So those students that did that, it helped clarify your thinking, especially the problem is with regions, as we see with this next one here. Again, they're just looking to see if you can correctly read the data in the graph and then, translate that into a similarity and difference. So here, this student wrote the South spends less than $10,000, but New England spends the most on education. And unfortunately, it's factually incorrect information because the most was $16,000 or more, and we saw states outside of New England also spend that amount. So New England can't spend the most, right? And the more you rely on regions and the larger the region, the less ill-defined the region is, the more likely you are going to include factually incorrect information. For example, if you said something about the North, you had to remember that Alaska is in the North and Idaho is in the North. If you said the South, then you had Louisiana sitting out there kind of as an outlier. If you said the West, Wyoming was an outlier. Midwest, Illinois was an outlier. So your best bet here was just to do a straight up comparison by state. Then you could be very specific. Now, once you did your comparison or your difference or your similarity, then you had to draw a conclusion based on that difference and similarity. So you had to make sure, like if you were comparing New York to Florida, that your conclusion was about New York and Florida. You couldn't just draw your conclusion about something else unrelated to your described difference or your described similarity. Okay? So this student wrote, one can conclude that up in the Northeast, education is taken more seriously, thus the increase in spending. Also in the Southeast, one can infer education is not as important since the South is a rich agricultural community. That's a great one. It needs to be about something other than education spending because that's the information that's available to us, that's visible to us in the graphic. This person decided to do it about values. Now, the hint I gave you is, so I said, use the term in the last part in C as a hint. And that kind of threw some students, pointed them in the wrong direction. So I'm not saying ignore looking at that term as a hint, but it's probably not what you want to rely on, because what I meant here is when they suggested federalism, it was a hint that your conclusion or that your described difference should be a difference. Okay, when we look at federalism, we're saying, okay, the states might be different from one another. So I'm going to describe a difference rather than a similarity. That was kind of the hint given by federalism. Otherwise, what you want to do is think about, okay, what I'm seeing here is some states spend more on education spending and some states spend less. What would be a possible impact if states spend more versus states spend less? What impact that might have on teacher salaries? What impact might that have on the quality of education or on the technology available to students, or even like the cleanliness of the school buildings or the modernity of the school buildings themselves? You can also just have a conclusion about state budgets, not national budgets, about state budgets, or a conclusion about how much taxes people pay in the two states that you compared and contrasted. All right, now in this next one, we see the big error that students tend to make. So which draws a conclusion of northern states spend more on education than southern states. This student here did not earn a point because it actually drew a conclusion about education spending, and you need to do it beyond that. It has to be something other than that. This data is already visible to us in the graphic, so it's not an actual conclusion. It's just a further description of the data that's already there. All right, so let's move on to the last point. Okay, so last point you were asked to, right there, explain how public education spending demonstrates the principle of federalism. The very first thing you want to do is define federalism, because that's what they want to know. They want to be able to ascertain, do you understand federalism? And then, do you understand how it's reflected in this data? So the first thing you have to do is define federalism. This student response doesn't get to it right away, but they do define federalism. Public education spending, as shown, demonstrates the principle of federalism by showing that everyone does not have to pay the same and schools are run by the states. Federalism is the separation of state and federal government. I would prefer the definition that it's a division of power between state and national governments. Okay. The different amounts spent shows that schools are run by the states, because if schools were run by the national government, everyone would have to pay the same. Now, a lot of you have very similar responses to that. People did well on this particular one. The only time they really didn't do well is when they failed to define federalism, like in this response here. You don't see a clear definition of federalism, and therefore they didn't do a good job demonstrating that they understand what it is and how it's demonstrated in the graphic. So that's what you need to do. Now, the only other tip I would give people in general is make sure you separate your response to A from your response to B from your response to C. You don't necessarily have to separate the B1, B2 aspects of the question, but you can if you want to. If it's helpful to you, you can do that. All right. Hopefully that's helpful and gets you on the right track for Wednesday. Talk to you all later. Bye.